One of the most important elements of effective democracy is an informed electorate. And in our country and other countries around the world and other democracies, the media or the press, whichever you call it, plays that role, takes that role in informing the electorate of what's going on in their world and how they're affected by the decisions made by their government, what the stands taken by the politicians that they have a choice to elect, and so on.
As our world becomes more and more technologically oriented, and so many decisions about public policy are driven by a good understanding of the science that underlies that technology, it is very important that the public be able to access the technical information that our universities and our governments are producing.
One of the things these two regions have in common is that they have small rural populations spread out over large areas. And so they're serviced in many cases by small media outlets, whether it's a newspaper or a radio station. And sometimes those newspaper outlets are one-person operations, maybe two or three, but very few people usually. They don't have a lot of the resources to go out and cover as many things as they'd like to, and a lot of them don't have a lot of training in journalism either. A lot of the technical news, the environmental news, scientific news is presented in these newspapers in verbal terms. It's just described, as opposed to being shown, which most of that information is easier to understand if it is shown to you in some way, whether it's in a chart or a map or a diagram that helps to explain visually what it is that's being discussed or being considered. Even the use of photographs in a lot of these stories is something new to many of these journalists, and both here and in the Altai Republic. We envisioned this project as a way of helping the small-town journalists in Kansas and the small-town journalists in Siberia to better report some of those issues for their electorates.
Every time we visit the Altai Republic, it seems to be an occasion for a news story. So people from our delegation are often interviewed. Sometimes it's organized, and sometimes they find us wandering around the streets of the city and to begin asking us questions. One of the reasons that we're working on the project we are today is because the very first project we had funded by ALO was on water quality. And the very first stories on public health that were published in any papers in the Altai Republic came about as a direct result of that work that we were doing with the university. So we're seeing the need and the interest of journalists in technical information and environmental information has been built over the years by our past exchanges. Gorno-Altaisk State University does not have a formal school of journalism, so it's important for them to be able to develop some capacity to provide that service to the community and to the profession in another alternate means. During this trip to the Altai Republic, we were accompanied by faculty from Kansas State University and students from the University of Kansas who both specialize in journalism. And we were able to meet with journalists a few times. One was to share information with journalists in the Republic on the purpose of our trip, namely the grant that we received from ALO to work with the university to develop their capacity for training journalists, and also students in their own university in journalistic practices.
And the first one was a meeting with Vladimir, and he's an ecological journalist from the Altai, and he's been covering forest fires. They've been having forest fires recently, and he's covered them, and he started in his own newspaper to cover ecological issues around the Altai, and showed us copies of those and showed us pictures that he had taken of the forest fires, and so he's very interesting.
The second opportunity we had to work with journalists was a workshop that the university sponsored at the campus to share information from our perspective, the U.S. perspective, on what appropriate practices were for journalists in terms of print media. Abby's the one who discussed a lot of basic journalism practices with the reporters.
And really the workshop wasn't about better, though, or worse. It was just me explaining to them how we do things, you know. So I held up a copy of the Lawrence Journal World, and I said, we usually have about 5 stories on our front page. Here's how we organize them. And here's how we do this and this, and showed them, just kind of walked them through the paper, I guess. And then we got to have a question session with them and talk about, well, how do they put their paper together, and what kind of environmental reporting do they do, because that was really the focus. I talked about the design and putting a paper together. And then Dee Vernberg talked about the environmental aspects.
Dee Vernberg gave a case study of the cryptosporidium outbreak that we had in Lawrence a few years ago, and covered it from the perspective of what information the journalists were providing to the public during the different stages of the outbreak. She discussed what types of articles were in the newspaper and in the media when the outbreak first occurred, to provide public information to the community, and then talked about how the phases of the investigation, figuring out where the outbreak was occurring, what kind of health impacts were affected, and gave a very good overview of what the media's responsibility was to the public during that particular crisis that we were having in Lawrence at the time.
I'm a scientist, and I was working with another student on the trip who was a journalist, and I found it very helpful because we had those two areas of the grant working together, and we were able to kind of play off each other, and we both had kind of different, well, I guess, access to different groups and different people on the trip, so we could bring information back to each other. And it was especially helpful when we were being interviewed, because she was a little more comfortable in that situation than I was, and plus she knew Russian, so that was helpful.
The synergy that's happened or come about between all the different programs and grants that we've had here in the last few years has really been amazing. This journalism project has been the most recent of many of these projects that have involved Altai Republic and Gorno-Altaisk State University. And from the visits that we've had of them here to our visits going over there, the increasing awareness of each other's cultures and the friendships and the associations that have developed has been really remarkable. And I was lucky enough to get to go last year with the group that came from the Altai Republic, from Gorno-Altaisk State University, to the Navajo Nation in Arizona, and we visited Canyon de Chelly and Monument Valley and the Grand Canyon. And of course, for even Americans, getting to see the Grand Canyon is often a once-in-a-lifetime experience. So to get to take these Russians to see the Grand Canyon and see their expressions and see their reactions to it was really, really remarkable and really wonderful.
We have a group of 7 people, 4 faculty and 3 students. 2 of them are working on the individual programs, and 5 of us were able to come here to Arizona with the president of the university, Yuri Tabakayev, and the chief biologist of our university, Nikolai Malkov. You know that we have differences, and still there are many things in common, and we have common problems, and we were able to learn how they're being solved here in the United States in native communities, and I think that this experience might be implemented back in Russia when we return to our home country.
That was actually how I first got involved with this group. I was doing a report for the journal World, and I was the Saturday reporter because nobody else wanted to come in, and I was lowest on the totem pole. So I get there on 9 o'clock on Saturday morning like I normally do, and there's this note on my desk that my editor had left for me. He said, "There's a canoe trip, go find them and do a story." And I was like, what? He didn't even give me a place on the Kansas River to find these people. He didn't give me a time, absolutely nothing. Luckily, the photographer had come in earlier and managed to call the Friends of the Ka man who was, getting the whole trip organized and taking the whole trip. And she sort of briefed me on what was going on, and that's when I found out that it was a group of visiting Russians, and I was like, wow, this is so cool. I can use some of my language abilities, and maybe they'll understand me. And I was really excited. And so when we finally got there, we had to stand on this bridge and watch to see if the canoe, people would float on down. So once we found them, it was just such a a great group of people, and the project, as they explained it, was so interesting. And then, you know, Cynthia came and said, "You're a journalist who speaks Russian. We could use you." And so I found this great trip and applied for an INSEP, which is National Security Education Program. And I actually got it, and so they're going to send me to Russia next year, and I'll spend the first semester studying in Gorno-Altaisk with a private tutor, because it's actually I was the first foreign student that they've ever had study there. And they didn't really know what to do with me, so they found a tutor who's willing to work with me, and I actually got to meet her, and she's so nice. I think that it's going to work out really well.
Just as it was for many of the Native American students who went to Gorno-Altaisk State University several years ago, the students and the faculty from over there don't always have many opportunities to travel abroad, let alone all the way around the globe to the United States. So these trips have been remarkable for them, and have opened their eyes to a great many things, and have helped them to see how much smaller the world really is, and to help them feel like they're much more a part of it than they might ever have been able to feel if they had just stayed right there in their own region of the world.
Если раньше нам казалось, что Земля очень большая, то сейчас при современной технике и прочее она оказалась очень маленькой. Это наш единый общий дом. Естественно, что общий дом – это наша общая забота.